Republicans and Democrats in Congress are on the brink of approving a whopping $858 billion in funding for the military for the current fiscal year. That is more than $45 billion over President Biden's original asking price. The big recipients of this massive defense budget are weapons makers, including the government, and the largest contractors, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. And at the center of the ever-increasing budget are the threats from China and Russia and, of course, the war in Ukraine.
According to a New York Times analysis, the Pentagon budget will have increased 4.3% per year over the last 2 years, if Congress approves it.
So, Ameshia, where are you on military spending in general and specifically on this package?
So, Batya, this may come as a surprise to you, and it comes as a surprise to people who are on the left as well. I have never supported the exorbitant budgets that the military-industrial complex has. It's quite frankly frustrating to see it swell year after year after year. And there are just so many other things that we could put a lot of this money towards. I'm sorry. To see this go up and to even be sizably increased from what Biden's original asking price was is quite frankly frustrating. And I don't think that it's necessary. We know that Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, there are hundreds of defense contractors who are making money hand over fist. And at this point, it's just really disgusting to see, acknowledging the issues that everyday Americans are having, trying to make ends meet, and all of the other programs and things that would help America to be more competitive. At the end of the day, there's only so much money to go around, but somehow the military-industrial complex continues to increase, irrespective to us not actively being in war anywhere.
I cannot agree with you more. The idea that China and Russia pose a military threat to the U.S. just seems to me to be totally delusional. China is our greatest threat, I believe, but from an economic point of view, from a domestic policy point of view, from a point of view of which country has the largest growing middle class, it's China, it's not us, right? All of these things that make a nation great, right? Whose children have much more upward mobility. But the idea that China is going to wage a war on us is just totally delusional. Their entire economic policy is bound up in, actually stealing American jobs. And the idea that Russia is somehow capable, Russia is struggling to even hold on to Crimea, which is something that, by the way, it's been struggling to do since it took Crimea. The idea that Russia has the capacity and the wherewithal to start waging war on the United States, even any other NATO countries, it is just absolutely absurd. And I cannot agree with you more. This is just a justification to take taxpayer dollars and funnel them into the pockets of these billionaires and these corporations that produce weapons, that produce death. For what? Why? How is this in the U.S. national interest? How are we spending our money on this instead of on the actual struggles that you and I talk about all the time that are facing average working Americans today? And I can't help but feel that this need to virtue signal over the war in Ukraine has just given both parties an excuse to try to one-up each other and get back to that thing of forever wars that President Trump, he won by fighting against that and saying, why are we not putting our country first?
No, I agree. I think that what we're seeing here in the protection of democracies across the globe is extremely important. It's part of, the ethos of who America is. But I do think there's something to be said about Russia versus Ukraine and the idea that this could go on for a really long time. I think that walking into this, there was an understanding that it wasn't going to resolve itself quickly, but also an understanding that Russia's economy is a dime in comparison to what America's happens to be, and even smaller when we think about what China's happens to be. Our reliance on them for anything is extremely low. I believe that China has a much greater vigilance and is a much greater threat to America than Russia will ever be. But in addition to that, militarily, neither of them are really an argument for us. When it comes to China, I personally am more frustrated with the idea that they could do something to our grid system. They could, hack into our capacity banking wise and other things, because we know that they have several they haven't found an intellectual property right they're not willing to expose. There are other things that we should be looking towards, I think, and things that are not going to be protected by an increase in military industrial spending. we have a lot of issues in terms of our competitiveness. China has surpassed us in many ways. And instead of investing in and advancing ourselves to the extent that our education system is subpar in many areas across the country, at the P to 12 level, as well as at the higher ed level, that we don't make things here anymore, at least to the effects that we did decades or generations ago. The fact that we are so reliant on Chinese products, there's a lot that we could be doing and investing right here, and seeing this explosion of military industrial spending is quite frankly just maddening at this point.
I could not agree with you more. You know, there was a really funny interview that Candace Owens did with President Trump where she was trying to get him to denounce the vaccine that he's so proud of. And, he kept refusing to do so. And finally, she said, look at our school kids. They're wearing masks. It's terrible. School kids aren't wearing masks in China. And President Trump said, if our school children were learning like the school children in China, we'd be doing a lot better, right? And there's something so fundamentally true about that. TikTok is banned in China because it is so dangerous for children. They get completely addicted to it. It is, and this is why the number one thing that children, if you ask them in America, what do you want to be when you grow up? The number one answer now is a social media influencer. In China, the number one answer is an engineer. We've just fallen off. And I could not agree with you more. This kind of spending, this focus, the idea of taking all of this money and funneling it into the top to create weapons, that's just a self-perpetuating, funding of elites at the expense of everybody else. It really gets to the heart of the problem. China is not a threat militarily. It is a threat to us culturally and a threat to us economically because the elites don't care about the working class and upward mobility for the most vulnerable Americans.
If I could have had a cheering section for you, Batya, on that point, I would have definitely ushered it in. Just because I do think that there's so much truth and truth to power spoken in what you just said, because at the end of the day, we've seen this time and time again. Our competitiveness in math, in science, our competitiveness in product creation, in ensuring that we are able to survive as an economic stronghold and stay at number one. If we talk about American exceptionalism, yes, we can all pat ourselves on the back for certain things and the the history of how we got here and how we became this nation that the globe looks at in terms of one of the strongest democracies or the strongest democracy, even though we've teetered a little bit as of late. But none of that amounts to the growth, the expansion, the crazy amount of competitiveness that we have seen from China. And I think that we're steadily hitting a point where we're not going to be able to catch up. And that is my major fear, a lot more than anything militarily, to your point. They're not thinking about that either. It is, they can, if they keep going at the pace that they are, crush us without ever having a troop on the ground.
Yeah, 100%. And I will just say, I found it so upsetting how the right treated President Biden after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, because he really, he wasn't the first one to promise that we were going to get out. President Biden promised we were going to get out, and we didn't. He couldn't do it. President Trump promised we were going to get out, and he couldn't do it. He was rolled over by the State Department, and President Biden showed up and he said, I'm going to do it, and he did it. And instead of cheering him on for getting us out of this forever war, the right just attacked him mercilessly, as did the Democrats, by the way. There was very little difference. And now, of course, we're mired in another war. We don't have troops on the ground, but $20 billion and rising and climbing. There's ever more demand that we keep funding this war in Ukraine. Nobody is talking about diplomacy. Nobody is explaining why whether Crimea belongs to Russia or Ukraine is a question that is of such great national interest, American U.S. national interest. And nobody's asked the American people what they think about this. And even, Kevin McCarthy, who promised no more funding for Ukraine before the midterms, right? Got those votes, and now, of course, doesn't have the power to actually enact anything like this because of the disarray in his own caucus. So, I just think, to me, this question of where do we stand on foreign policy? Are we going to keep putting other countries ahead of ourselves, or are we going to focus on our own citizens, the most vulnerable citizens, the most disinvested in communities, working class communities, Black communities, or are we going to keep taking that money and funneling it into other people's problems and other people's conflicts that could have been resolved with diplomacy very early on?
Couldn't agree more. Military contractors' support for war efforts in Ukraine were on full display at the Ukrainian embassy's reception held last week, honoring the 31st anniversary of the country's armed services. In fact, America's biggest weapons maker sponsored the event, with logos of Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Pratt, and Whitney, plus Lockheed Martin, were plastered throughout the event space. Batya, what do you think about this? What can we make of, and this goes back to a previous segment, but what can we make of the players here, the funding and the plastering of the names of some of the nation's largest beneficiaries of the military industrial complex?
You know, the thing that is admirable about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is that he will do anything that he thinks is in the interest of Ukraine, including extremely problematic things like inviting people to a party funded by Raytheon, right? I mean, there's something so unsavory about this, having the ambassadorship of a foreign country co-hosting a party with these weapons manufacturers, right? It just really, really smacks of a conspiracy theory that I don't think is true, right? Which is that the only reason we're supporting Ukraine is to make money for Raytheon, right? I don't believe in that conspiracy theory. I don't think that's why President Biden has been, in my opinion, overly supportive of this war effort. I think that it comes from, a more, honest place of wanting to help an ally, even if I disagree with the way that they've done it. But when you have something like this, an invitation that has the official logo of Ukraine, the country, right next to the fact that this party is being funded by these massive weapons corporations that are making bank off of helping Ukraine, funding this war, giving them the weapons they need, it really, really undermines the idea that, that this is anything other than that, right? And I think that, even if it gives the appearance of such a dark connection here, that I really think this was a huge mistake.
I think that you're right here, and I was going to say that as well. It's the imagery. I don't think that there was any type of ideology or co-opting of the efforts of the Biden administration or those who have been trying to be supportive of Ukraine throughout this process. Again, protecting democracies. That's kind of the brand that the United States has taken for quite some time now. But I would be hard pressed to say that this does not look really bad. And to that point, it is a grave misunderstanding or just not playing well to the field to not understand how hosting these people, how having their names on the banner is not problematic. To your point, I don't believe in the conspiracy theories either, but darn, this does not help to alleviate them by any means.
Right, exactly. And of course, the point is, if you're making rockets so you can ship those over to Ukraine, you're not taking that investment, that funding, that capacity and using it to create microchips, right? Using it to create the kinds of things that would support American industry long term down the road. And that is the thing that really bothers me about this. It always comes down to who are you putting first? Are you putting our future first, the future of our children first, the future of our nation first, or are you thinking constantly about the bottom line and this country and that country? And again, I wish the people of Ukraine well. I think they fought bravely. I'm glad to see them winning. I'm glad to see them holding their own. But this conflict could have been ended in March with diplomacy. And that was just never on the table. And I really want to understand better why that was, as somebody who's fighting against the idea that it was a conspiracy to put billions of dollars into the pockets of Raytheon, et cetera. I really do think that should, anybody who's putting a call for that on the table is doing the right thing, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And tomorrow on Rising, I'll be right back here at the desk with Brianna Joy Gray while Robbie's out sick. We'll get into all the biggest news of the day. Batya, always great to see you. Thank you so much for hosting with me today.
It was such a pleasure. Can't wait to watch you tomorrow.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to your podcasts.